Humans Take on the World, Episode 21. Why Is It? With Harry Margulies. Welcome to another episode of Humans Take on the World. Sorry this is later than I was expecting and hoping for. The interview ended up having to be scheduled out a little bit further than I was planning on, and, life happened. Projects not related to the podcast happened, and it was a very necessary break. So don't expect the next break to be that long. Should have another episode out here pretty soon. But for now, let's get to the interview with Harry. We are now joined by Harry Margulies, author of Why Is It? Harry, welcome to Humans Take on the World.
Thank you. And you are joining me all the way in London, England.
Yeah. And I'm here in Boise, Idaho. So before we get into the book, you have a fascinating story. So tell us how did you get started as a refugee in Austria?
Well, my parents, who had suffered the Holocaust, both survived, were then fearful of the communists invading Romania, where they were, and tried to make their way to the West. They ended up in Austria, where we ended up in a refugee camp, and I spent my first 6.5 years there till 10 years after the war. In 1955, Sweden let us in as refugees.
Oh, wow. So, yeah, Germany to Romania to Austria. That's quite the journey to Sweden. So then you were 6 when you moved to Sweden?
6.5, yeah.
All right. And I bet that was quite the transition.
It was, but, coming from a refugee camp where all I had was fear of neo-Nazis still throwing stones into our windows in the barracks where we lived, where the rabbis had taken hold of me and taught me to read the most difficult Hebrew and biblical texts, and teaching others as a young boy, and not having a real life, very cramped conditions. And coming to Sweden, I can tell you that the first night we spent at a reception camp, waking up in the morning, they offered us boiled eggs. And I asked if I could get a second egg because I still liked them the way I got it then. The white hard and the yolk soft. And they gave me a second egg, and I thought I was in heaven. It was just an unbelievable experience.
Yeah. Wow. And yeah, that experience in the refugee camp sounds quite rough.
But like everything else, you deal with your background and you move on.
True.
We came to Sweden. We had no choice. And having no choice, my mother told me, if you don't do better than the people around you, you're going to get nowhere. And studying hard was the message. Work. Nothing is going to come on its own.
Right. So you followed the model of immigrants who tend to be economically more productive than people born in the country they live in.
Probably, at least to some extent.
And so, all right, so you grew up in Sweden. And when you got to Sweden, was your family going to synagogue or?
Oh, yes. We were all going to synagogue. And I can tell you that at the age of 12, on a Yom Kippur, the Jewish fasting holiday, I fainted. And the rabbi came out and said, "You're not bar mitzvah yet, you can eat." And I said, "No way, I'm not going to eat." I mean, I was such a firm believer, still fearful of the Lord. And the Lubavitch rabbis in New York heard about that, and they sent a delegation to Sweden to offer my poor parents to take me to New York and educate me as rabbi and medical doctor, which was an extremely tempting proposition to come to New York in that. Luckily, it didn't happen.
All right. And was so I would assume this was a pretty Orthodox Jewish community?
It wasn't at all. I mean, we came into the synagogue was sort of Orthodox, and the community was modernized, and there were Swedes that had come before the war, and then there were the Swedes that have come, or the refugees that have come after the war, and a little tension even there too. The Swedes who had come before the war were afraid that the rest of us were going to muck up the relationship with the local community.
Mm-hmm.
So there's always tension, and it was felt. No matter what it is, I mean, you must know that, having interviewed a lot of people, when something hits you, deal with it. What else can you do? I mean, you can either succumb to higher forces, and eventually you realize there is no higher force to help you. You've got to help yourself. And that happened to me at around the age of 14.
All right. And so that's when you left religion?
Well, it's an interesting story. I decided one day that God can't really be bothered with what I eat. I'd never tried non-kosher food in my life. So I went to a hot dog stand and bought a hot dog. And I thought, that is bloody good. And I had another one and another one. I had 10 hot dogs and had stomachache. And for a second, I thought, God is punishing me. And then I said to myself, no. I just had too many hot dogs. And that was the end of it, or the beginning of the end of it. I sort of freed myself from the shackles of an imaginary supervisor that way.
I grew up Adventist, so no pork or shellfish. Followed all the kosher stuff except for actually the technical part of kosher. And the first time I knowingly had pork, it made me sick to my stomach. Second time I knowingly had pork, it made me sick to my stomach. And I figured, nope, that's proof this is legit. Once I left religion, I ate bacon almost every day for a couple years, no problem.
And it tastes good.
Yeah. I'm still not a fan of pork chops, but bacon is great.
Yeah, it is. You know, it is funny that God would tell us what to eat instead of making everything we eat healthy, or even better. He could have prevented us from sullying the environment by creating us, which he could have done, living on air alone, or with 100% combustion, so there's no thing to excrete, nothing to sully anything. And he never did. And yet we are so grateful for what he supposedly did in 6 days, which he could have done in a microsecond of a microsecond, and still come up with this lousy results. I'm just saying, going a little ahead of myself, but I'm just saying it is important to understand that it is confirmation bias that makes us be grateful for what we believe. There could have been other texts that would have been equally grateful today and equally holy. Men picked them and made them holy, and now we're supposed to believe it.
Yeah. Yeah, and everybody's experience, whether the experience helps confirm what confirmation bias makes very easy to confirm, or makes it a little harder to hold on to that, it nudges us one way or the other.
Absolutely. I mean, you found your way, as you explained, and your journey is similar to mine. I mean, it started with food in a way.
Yeah.
You have to find that little nugget of something that will help you with the deconversion. And after that, of course, I went into study. I read the Bible, I read the New Testament, I read the Quran, I read a number of books that were interesting to me. And I think one of the first ones that got me really interested was Michener's The Source. And I found it so liberating that he had what I call the inner story, which was in an archaeological dig. They found items, and he would have a biblically accurate story around the items. And then there was an outer story around that, and the outer story is the archaeological dig. And I have taken that with me when I look at biblical texts. And tell me if I'm jumping. It's your interview.
Oh, no, this is good.
So now when I look at biblical text, for instance, what is the morality in the Bible? I always ask myself, what is the inner story and what is the outer story? The inner story about Job is a God-fearing man stood by God no matter what. The outer story is the utter immorality of an all-seeing, all-knowing being to make a bet with Satan, knowing the outcome of a life of somebody who has no reason to. Abraham. Why? Why the heck ask him to sacrifice when he knew he's not going to go through with it? So when we say that the Bible is full of moral lessons, if we take biblical text as metaphor, I'm always asking, what effing metaphor? What is it we are supposed to learn? Because God describes himself as proud of being evil, as having created evil, commanded, committed evil. and then allowed all kinds of unvirtuous things to apply. And then we say, but God is good and we just don't understand.
Mm-hmm.
Just going to jump on that a little more and say, God is fully capable in the next life to create a fully free life without sin and still with free will. Come on, why not here?
Yeah. Yeah, and I did a archaeological dig, and
Wow.
It was in the Madaba Plains of Jordan in a late Iron II Edomite city that was probably destroyed by the Babylonians. And a different field in that particular dig than where I was specifically working found some of the actual ballistics that were used to take down the wall.
Mm-hmm.
We also found lots of bones from what people were eating. Lots of sheep and goats, a little bit of beef, and we found proof that the Edomites in the 6th century BCE ate pork.
Mm-hmm.
There wasn't any evidence up to that point that the Edomites had eaten pork. There was probably some assumption that they probably, followed similar dietary rules to their Jewish neighbors, but no, they ate pork.
Mm-hmm. So you have discovered the truth in the Bible. Pork eating was everywhere.
Oh, yeah. If you're hungry and there is something you can eat, you will eat it.
Yeah.
If you have scraps and you want to turn those scraps into delicious food, you have pigs.
Yeah, absolutely. Interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah. And then also traveling while I was there, because it was 6 weeks long, and on the weekends we traveled around to various places. It was just shocking how small the area the Bible stories are in is.
That is the most, I'm just going to say, I'm taking your theme and taking it into my own way a little further. My view is, if God really loved the Jews, why did he give them that little piece of land surrounded by 100 million enemies eventually? He could have given them Switzerland, and they would have been fine.
Mm-hmm.
And they would have been living in peace and being prosperous with fabulous climate. They didn't. He didn't. He surrounded them by enemies with very little natural resources. And there's still no peace.
Yeah.
Although the Abrahamic records have done a little bit to go further. So the promises of God to the Jews is quite amazing. They were going to sort of take over everything. They're going to be as many as grain of sand. There are less than 15 million left. And and at the same time, the Jews get the blame for just about all evil that has ever happened,
mm-hmm.
which in turn comes from the really fake trial before Pontius Pilate. I mean, none of that can have happened.
Right.
I don't know if you want me to get into that and why I feel that. Do you want me to go into that, or do you want to say that?
Sure.
Yeah. I'm just saying that, first of all, Pontius Pilate was a real bastard of a governor. He was called home because he was that bastardly. The historical Pontius Pilate would never have put up with any kind of rebellious Jew of any sort. His wife supposedly had a dream, didn't tell him in the morning, but sent him a note. Now, who the heck read that note? Except Pontius Pilate, but everybody knows to report it. Pontius Pilate gets a bit whimsical about this, and this innocent man is standing before him. And here comes the story. So he washes his hands while the Jews around there are screaming, "May crucify Jesus, may his blood be over us and our children." Here is where I stop. I can imagine a crowd screaming, "Crucify the bastard." Nobody would have cursed their children. It just didn't happen.
Yeah.
So if you add all of that together, you ask yourself, what else is untrue? And then they say, well, it's the witnesses. To which I say, well, if it's the witnesses in a fictional story are equally fictional. Don't we get that? So when we go to how they describe this then is, well, when Jesus died, the saints crawled out of their graves and wandered around in Jerusalem for many to see. Now, what kind of witnesses? Is this an additional truth, or is it additional evidence of the untruthfulness of the fictionality in the stories?
Yeah. And
by the way, there's no contemporaneous evidence that there was a Jesus. Nobody knows there was one. If there wasn't, you have to hold on to that, because there was no sacrifice and no resurrection and no Christianity. Jesus was Jewish, was rabbi. On day 40, he was going with his mother to the temple for her to be cleansed and he to be redeemed as the firstborn. His last meal was a Passover supper, for crying out loud.
Mm-hmm.
And yet Christianity came with Paul on the road to Damascus. He invented it. And here's a funny story. We have no contemporaneous evidence for Jesus, but we have all his witnesses. But he raised a couple of dead people. Who wouldn't want to know their story? And we know nothing.
Right.
What we know, though, is that Paul on the road to Damascus also was credited with raising the dead, just for one-upmanship, which means another fictional story to show credentials and closeness to God. And he had never met Jesus and made up the entire story with a dream. So just my way of reasoning through this, if it's interesting to you.
And Paul even brags about how he dreamed it all up.
Yeah.
Nobody told him anything. He just saw it in a dream.
Yeah, and isn't that wonderful? And it becomes absolute truth. And had we not had that dream, there would have been no Christianity. Had the Emperor Constantine not embraced it to some extent, it would have been a minor sect. And we can move this all along, how happenstance it is that we are where we are. Had Martin Luther not been serving under corrupt pope, there would have been no Protestantism.
Mm-hmm.
Had Henry VIII been allowed to divorce, there would have been no Anglican Church or Church of England. So it all happens that yet all of these denominations believe that they are the true bearers of God's message, and all others are wrong, which tells you who else is wrong.
Yeah. All right. So getting back to your story, after so you got your education and went into tax accounting, correct?
I went into tax advisory, not accounting directly, but tax advisory. I advised on international tax issues. And I took an MBA and part of a law degree in Sweden. And what I learned from that was to read texts for what texts say. So I could read a text or a tax treaty or an international treaty or something and say, this is what it says. And I wouldn't care what a professor would have said or any commentary. If I felt I could convince a judge I was right, then I was right.
Mm-hmm.
One of my early cases when I was 33 that I won had Sweden and England renegotiate the tax treaty because my interpretation was right.
Oh, wow.
From that, I learned that if God would have wanted to make himself clear, he could have.
Mm-hmm.
Every time people interpret it their different ways, what I say to that is self-appointed interpreters of God's true word are needed differently to come to different explanations and then fight over it, and we are supposed to believe. Isn't that denigrating God as a communicator? So my take is, if God wants to tell me something, I believe he's capable. And don't even blame translations that are faulty, because God could have inspired them equally. He knew what translations were going to come from the beginning. So I read text, I read the text for what it says, and if you say, well, my God tells me, and I say, he didn't tell me. It's very simple. I don't read it that way. I can't. This is what the text is. But you have to understand. No, I don't. You understand it. The fact that you truly believe in something doesn't force me to find that to be factual. So I learned that from that, and I think I was pretty good at reading legal text from having learned to read the Bible for what it says, not what I've been taught. So it was a bit of cross-contamination both ways. And I think in my career, I've done pretty well.
All right. And then since then, you've moved to Canada and England.
Yeah, I lived in Canada for 38 years, where my family was with me. My youngest daughter was born in Canada. My two older children were born in Sweden. And I have a daughter and a couple of grandkids here, so I thought I'd spend a couple of years in England on my retirement and then move back to Canada to my other two children and a granddaughter there.
Okay.
All atheists.
Very nice. So sounds like you like Canada.
It's a very nice country. And so is Sweden in many ways. I mean, I think that if you are prepared to accept the culture around you, most places are pretty decent. It is when tribalism comes to fore too much. I think when everybody believes that everybody else is wrong and I'm the only one right, they're almost always wrong. My take and the advice I've given my children is when everybody else is into something, it's a good sign that you're almost always wrong. I don't know if you've heard about the the issue about the madness in crowds. And the way I explain it is, one person listening to Hitler would found him a madman. 10,000 cheering, you get pulled along.
Mm-hmm.
Then you might think there's something to this. And why don't I believe this? So it is how this was staged that made it work.
Yeah. And yeah, there's historical accounts of mass delusions.
Yeah.
And in recent years, we've been able to see it with would-be fascists having rallies with, Donald Trump and Duarte and the like.
And believing whatever comes out of their mouth. I think Trump is a flawed personality. But lately we have seen that the current president, and I have no game in this, has his own issues. Mm-hmm. So I think the danger is believing that the other side is ultimately always wrong is a problem. Democracy requires two poles, at least. And there are times when the Democrats have been the worst ones, and now there are times when the Republicans are the worst one. It seems to me that there is a method through which the madness solves itself, and the same in religion. It is back to the tribalism, which we humans are very capable of, and comes back in both religion, denomination, it comes back in politics, and even in sports when people are willing to kill each other for rooting to the wrong football team. I mean, it's just unbelievable. So that, together with a bit of self-delusion, makes you believe you're always right, and you cannot see that there is an argument. I'm trying to be measured on my Twitter account, which is reasonably big now, and I try to follow people I don't agree with, because I learn more from them than getting my ego boosted from everybody who agrees with me. A little detour, since you brought it up.
Yeah. All right. So let's get into the book. Why is it we are afraid of being descendants of monkeys, but not incest?
Well, the title speaks for itself, doesn't it? I mean, if you ask a religionist, he would never agree that we have the same ancestors, the monkeys. But he doesn't mind that God created Adam and Eve, two sons, one killed, and then another son. So where do we come from if not from incest? And it's so that the whole process of excusing this, the apologetics that comes around it, well, didn't disallow it then? To which I say, didn't he know better? I mean, we might not have, but he surely must have known better that that's not a very good idea.
What's really funny is some of the more science-affirming churches accept that we are both descendants of monkeys and incest, including the Roman Catholic Church.
Yeah. They have, the Roman Catholic Church have been obsessed with a dogma and really haven't cared too much about belief. I mean, they have killed and burned people for dogma. They have. Why would any church, believing that God is with them, and they believe they're the only church created by Jesus Christ himself, or founded by Jesus himself, why would they need to burn scientists? Why would they need to lock them up? Why would it take all the way till 1992 to forgive Galileo for being right? Why did they first burn people at the stake and then find an even worse method, which is to have a mixture of oil and turpentine and some other things and boil people alive? In what universe could that have been right if you serve a God? So whenever they go to atheism and go to Marx, go to Stalin, go to Hitler, they at least didn't have a God to forgive them before they died. If you're Roman Catholic, the only thing you cannot be forgiven for is if you have blasphemed the Holy Ghost. Everything else is forgivable. Mass murder is not a problem.
Yeah. And Hitler's a interesting one, because there is some evidence that he may have had Catholic last rites before he died.
Listen, we can speculate. We don't know, but he did in some places actually say that he's doing the Lord's work when he gets rid of the Jews. So there must have been something. And by the way, where did he find so much positive input from his point of view? Well, go to Martin Luther's 7 points against the Jews. I have them in my book. More anti-Semitic than that, you just cannot find on this earth. Even the Nazis couldn't do better. And then you have Hitler's Pope, who made a concordat with Hitler to sort of basically leave him alone if he left the church alone. didn't the church understand what they were doing? I mean, they are for the good of everyone? Of course not. They were for thousands of years preaching that the Jews killed their God. And in my book, I asked the question, who can kill God? Can anybody kill God? So if God decided to crucify himself through his son, that is suicide by Roman crucifixion, like modern terms, suicide by cop. And so God's methodology in thinking this, I think I need to forgive the people again. I drowned them once. What do I do now? Well, I'll get a virgin and I'll get her pregnant. Then I'll have a son without telling his mother that he's going to be sacrificed. And then he's going to be sacrificed for the sins of other people and while he himself is completely innocent. Now, you tell me what kind of a decision tree that comes from. God could have just said, listen, I want to forgive the people, I will. So John 3:16, which says, and God so loved this world, it's one of those confirmation bias paragraphs.
Mm-hmm.
It could have read, and God so loved this world that he forgave everybody without sacrifice. And I'm asking Christians, would you not have accepted a sacrifice? Would you not have asked for a sacrifice? And my take on this additionally is, if you accept that that is a moral act by God, you should be prepared to die for my sins. I don't want to do
it. Oh, that's awesome.
You like that?
Yeah. It was actually one of the things that got me out of Christianity was the crucifixion. And the issue for me was the sacrificial atonement model doesn't work if the animal doesn't stay dead.
Right.
The fact that Jesus came back, if that was to atone for sin, then that suggests that either the wages of sin is torture or, it's death, but kinda.
Yeah. It's what I have a coffee that I call non-coffee coffee with very little caffeine and a lot of foam. This is a non-death death because Jesus, depending on where you listen to it or where you read it, was either down in hell and picked up the saintly souls, or he was sitting in heaven with his Father for a bit. So even those 2 days, he wasn't missing 3 because Friday to Saturday, Saturday to Sunday, he was very, very busy, which, by the way, goes together with Roman Catholic doctrine, which is that we can pray for the dead can pray for us, which is an amazing concept. They cannot pray for themselves if they're in purgatory, but they can still pray for us. That is such an incredible concept. And we have this modern scientific pope who can't get his head around that and who allows exorcism. Where the heck do these spirits come into your body that they need to be exorcised? Why does God allow them in? And if you take them out, have you not admitted that you're hampering God's work? What are you doing? What is it with original sin? So that there's only one person ever born without original sin. Mother Mary, the Virgin. Everybody else has original sin. Why? Has God declared that? Because of the fall of man? Or is it one way of making church relevant over a couple of thousand years, so everybody needs to have some water sprinkled, a couple of Latin phrases mumbled, and you get into the church?
Well, and then you have to pay up.
Of course, that follows.
Yeah.
The tithing is the one thing that they really know how to, just about every religion. It's part of the whole system of, I'm giving you salvation, but you got to pay. One way or the other, you got to pay. And so, a lot of bad people seek advice and seek forgiveness for their bad acts, and they give tithing. There's something wrong with that process. That's not, in my mind, high morality. Together with what the Catholics, by the way, never want to recognize, the fact that the Holy Communion turns them into cannibals, because it's not a symbol, it's that the blood and the wafer turn into the wine and the wafer turn into Jesus's blood and flesh. That's a definition. If you eat that, that's a definition of cannibal, and you can call it whatever you like. You're a cannibal. And I wonder how many sort of realize what that part of the dogma means when they go through it. They probably want to ignore it.
Well, some of the Roman era persecution of Christians was over cannibalism.
Yeah, I mean, it must have been weird for people that, that you eat the flesh of a god, demigod, a person who is a god. The fact that a person could be a god was probably not alien to Peter, who was Roman, because he knew how they turned Caesars into gods by vote. And when you go all the way up to the Council of Nicaea, the dogma that Jesus was God was by vote the same way as we now vote in a pope. And with all the popes, and as badly as they have behaved over time, what kind of guidance from the Holy Ghost do they really get? All the scandals, everything they've done. It's one of the worst organizations you can imagine. And yet they say it's just bad people within the church. But it's bad people within the church who probably sought their way there over thousands of years and knew that no parent would trust their child saying what he took up from under the cassock. No, he's a priest. Or all the homosexuality that Martel, a journalist, has proven to go on in the Vatican. And they're not only admitting it, they're proud of it because they know they can get away with it. So my take on what the church has done here is, if they're hiding their priests from temporal judgment, and the priests are not afraid from the judgment in hereafter, you don't have to be either. Just let it go.
Yeah. And clearly they aren't.
So back to my book. I mean, I wrote a number of chapters in my book, and my intent was to question and make people think. And in every chapter, I have a couple of Occam's razor kind of questions. And I try not to be demeaning. I try to make people think for themselves. And if they want to have faith, that's their business. I am one in my interviews who have said that I wouldn't want state to interfere in how I bring up my children. And therefore, I don't want state to interfere even how parents indoctrinate their children. Mm-hmm. But from that, a little aside, if you're prepared to listen, if there is a God, why does he need parents to indoctrinate their children differently in different geographies, different in different denominations, and then use the sword to spread that faith? How powerless is that God? And going to Islam, where according to their belief, every baby is born a true Muslim. In Christianity, they're born with original sin. Only in Judaism, they're born innocent, by the way. But in Islam, they're born. And then they lose 75% of the world's population to mere parental corruption. Now, to me, that tells how powerless is Allah, who starts with 100% in the right faith and then loses 75%. Oh, they say, wait, it's coming. Well, let's see.
And if you look at a lot of American denominations right now, they're losing 75 to 100% of their children even after indoctrination.
Yeah. You cannot have in the long run true secular education and science work together with faith. And every time when I tweet about this, I get a question. And by the way, my Twitter feed is Ask Why Is It, at Ask Why Is It, and same on Instagram. They are obsessed with saying, but it can work together. I say, no, it cannot, because faith requires the acceptance of supernatural explanations to the natural world. And as soon as you see it that way, it loses all relevance. And people can believe whatever they want, but you cannot say it's compatible with science. That would mean that our science needs to have a consciousness somewhere in the middle of an uncaring universe. There's so many issues that won't work. So going from that back to my book, going to the creation story is one, for instance, that people talk a lot about. Well, what did God create? He created a flat earth, and Christians and Jews say, no, it wasn't flat. They're like, yes, it was, because you cannot cover a globe with a dome. So if it's covered with a dome, it was flat. In that dome, sun and moon traversed, stars were sprinkled for viewing pleasure and fell on earth. The order of creation is completely horrendous. So God created light and pulled it out of darkness, just pulled it out of darkness. It's a bit odd, but okay. Then eventually he created the sun a couple of days later. But before he created the sun, he created vegetation. So I can understand that a couple of goat herders who wouldn't understand, but couldn't God produce a better message? And then on top of that, have two creation stories that are incompatible. I touch about that a bit in my book because I think that's fascinating. And then comes the true believer's explanation. A day doesn't mean a day. It means an eon of time. Well, I'm saying then it's even less likely that greenery would have survived if it took an eon of time till the sun came out. The wrong order works even worse under those circumstances.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely. But if the sun is just something that is in the dome, it doesn't matter because it's not where the light's coming from. But in the real world, that is where it all comes from.
Actually, God says that the light comes from the sun in the day and from the moon in the night, as if the moon was an independent light source. So we know that God actually says that and believed that. I mean, we can just go on. He created Adam and Eve in the first creation story simultaneously. In the second story, and here's one that every Christian or Jew should be a bit worried about. God suddenly discovers, oh, Adam is here alone. He needs a helper and somebody who's going to be subordinate to him. And he finds that that's not good for Adam to be alone. So he gets him to sleep, takes his rib, or what I call a spare rib, and makes Eve out. And now we have subjugated woman, which goes all the way through biblical text, all the way to the New Testament, where women are told to be silent. So whenever we decide we can have female priests or ministers or whatever it is, I personally don't care. I'm for whatever they want to do. But it is now saying we don't really believe in what God said. We believe in our own. So you might at least go fair enough and say, it's no longer religion. It's no longer to do with God. It's another thing. Okay. And that's one of the beefs I have with holy text is when you go back to them, and I said this before in another way, go back to the fact that it's supposed to be high morality. Where is that morality? Where's the morality when Lot offers his two virgin daughters to be raped to spare some angels? Where is God to think, or where's Lot to think that that is good, and where's God to first, after that fact, have the angels blind the mob? Then his wife turns to a pillar of salt, which might be money, because in the olden days, salt was a payment method. But leaving that aside. And then he ends up alone in a cave with his two virgin daughters, and they liquor him up. And after they liquored him up, they got him pregnant. And another version of incest, because they believed God could have sent a couple of young men over. A virgin who gets raped, this is incel paradise. She has no say in this. Her father gets some compensation, and she's forced to marry the rapist. That's brilliant. The morality of a slave owner who beats his slave, and the slave doesn't die the same day, it's okay. It's your slave after all. So we have stories about King David, who just about broke every covenant in every of the commandments, and still being the highest of all. And worst of all, he didn't suffer directly, but his son was killed, his baby boy. Yeah. That's another Jesus story. And then we can move on from there all the way to Jesus needing to be from the house of David. And here is where the Jews probably got it right. The Jews say that Messiah will come when the wolf and the lamb graze together. Now, that is effing never going to happen. So Messiah is never going to arrive. Yet, Messiah has to come from the house of David. If you look through the two genealogies of Jesus, both go over the house of David. Both go with different fathers of Joseph over Joseph, the husband of Mary. Now, what's wrong with this? Well, Joseph wasn't daddy. So the whole genealogy is wrong because there should be only one step. Jesus, Father, God. Period. And if they can't get that straight, you can just say nothing else is straight. It just doesn't work.
Yeah. Yeah, and any time in the Bible where there are two accounts of something, they're incompatible.
Yeah, and it gives everybody something to claim and everything. I mean, it's the same in Islam. Islam carries with itself one verse that says there's no compulsion in religion. And then you have this sword verse where if you are defeated, you have the right to go to the right religion. They may give you the right to live in the land if you pay a special head tax, which according to the Quran, you have to pay in a really, really, really submissive position, so everybody knows that you have no rights, really. Now, is that not freedom of religion? And one step further, if you are a non-believer, eventually you will be roasting and your skin will be renewed for renewed pain. And when you ask a Muslim scholar about this, it says, it just proves how scientific the Quran is. It contains all science. They knew that the pain receptors were in the skin, not about the high amorality in having skin renewed. It's the same as with the Bible. I mean, they all come with a similar kind of flaw. And without indoctrination, nothing of it works.
Yeah. One of my favorites, though, is with the crucifixion story. Peter's 3 denials are covered twice. And if you try to make sense of them and actually count them out, it's 5.
Yeah.
Because there's one in each story actually matches up. The other 2 don't.
Yeah. Well, you can say the same thing about the 10 Commandments. There are several versions of the 10 Commandments who nowhere are 10 and have made to 10 to match the fingers. And between various denominations, they are not the same either, which proves they don't come from God, were never on a stone tablet. And besides, is there any morality in those? The only one is probably thou shalt not kill, which really means thou shalt not murder unless God commands. And so we're stuck with the first commandment, which is thou shalt have no other gods before or beside me. Now, what does that mean? And God knows every language better than everybody else. And I've checked this with good Hebrew readers and understanders and knowers of Bible text. It means the same in Hebrew. So what that says is God accepted there were other gods as long as he was number one. And why was that the case? Probably because gods were geographical at the time. And even Yahweh understood that if you move to another geography, you may have to worship their God, but don't forget me, I am number one. Throughout most of the old part of the Bible, of the Torah, God is the head of the council of God. He is the one who will defeat the other enemy because their gods are weaker than he. There's an admittance of other gods. There's nowhere to say that the beginning of Judaism, Old Testament, is anything but multi-God. And then eventually it turned into, with the Shema prayer, eventually, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, God is one. But it didn't work until then. The only one, Christianity doesn't work either because they have the 3 that are 1. I call this Christian math where 1 + 1 + 1 = 1, which is an impossibility mathematically. Quran actually is the only one that have it right. There's only one God, period. And you have to give it to them. They knew how to express that, but they were also a couple of 100 years later.
Yep, they got to learn from Muhammad studied with Jews, he studied with Christians, and took the pieces he liked and left behind the pieces that didn't make sense. And then added all his own stuff that doesn't make sense.
Yeah. If you believe that Muhammad actually studied that way, or...
True.
I mean, it was a couple of 100 years later, probably 200 years later, that the mythology around him became Quranic text. And they got to pick and choose like everywhere else. And there are still several versions of the Quran out there, although they claim it's one. If it is a perfect book, by the way, why are there so many interpretations? Why are they violent and peaceful? Why is Shia and Sunni? Why are they having no less love lost for each other than Catholics and Protestant? Should be impossible. What is the explanation for them to say, well, all these ancient biblical heroes, they are really true Muslims, retroactively. So Allah first gave us the Old Testament, then he gave us the New Testament, and they became corrupted. Well, he knew that. He could have given us the Quran right away and everybody would have had the same religion. Somehow he didn't get that. And even worse, within the Quran, while he dictates this over 23 years to an illiterate man in a cave, he discusses with himself and says, don't like this verse. I'm going to abrogate it. And makes a newer verse to take away the previous verse. Just asking myself, how omnipotent is that God that doesn't know how to dictate a book to be perfect and still considered a miracle? Now, I'm sure there are fantastic apologetic explanations there, as there are in biblical text or for biblical text. It still doesn't make them true. And here's where I come back in again. The text should speak for itself. And if the text has all these flaws, had this been, as I say in my book, a science book, which on the first page would have said, you can pray away the effects of gravity, you would have put it down and never read the rest.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Do you have more points you want to cover, or do you want to wrap it up?
Well, I think it's up to you. It's your show, and I don't want to belabor you in any way. I think this has been wonderful talking to you, and I like that your and my background are so similar, and you even found your way out of it through food. The pig.
Food and study.
Yeah, food and study. Well, study is important, and you can let everybody know how difficult deconversion is. And I think it's like losing a family member. And people who deconvert need all the support they can get. They can lose family, they can lose friends, they lose their congregation, they lose a structure that has been built around this faith, which makes it difficult. I always counsel people to talk to me, but it is so incredibly liberating when you don't have an imaginary supervisor looking over your shoulder. And my take is also true morality comes from you being responsible for your actions and not saying, I am not responsible, but somebody is looking over my shoulders, which also allows you in a bad state to say, oh, I was told by God, he did this. He made me do it. And to have that kind of an out is not a good thing.
Yeah. All right. Well, where can people find your book?
Oh, it's on Amazon. And they should also probably try to follow me and look at my link tree in my Ask Why Is It account.
All right.
And my book, Ask Why Is It? We Are Afraid of Being Descendants of Monkeys, is a book that people could read for enjoyment. It is not theological. It is not too philosophical. I think if you have managed to make your way through some of it, it's very simple text. I don't have any footnotes. I make it easy for people to follow or not follow. It's their business.
Yeah. Simple questions with discussion of how crazy it is.
and it is crazy. But you know, when you live in a bubble, which they do, it's like, I call it the Stockholm syndrome of belief. You don't see outside that bubble. You believe that you got it straight. Is there anything you would like to bring up apart from what we have? I think one of the interesting points I would like to share with you is my take on burden of proof, which everybody seems to misunderstand. Okay. Is that too much for you, or do you still want me to?
No, let's do it.
Yeah. So burden of proof is when religious people ask us atheists to prove there is no God. And that is a really tough one because you cannot prove a negative. So you make the assertion, you have the burden of proof. And they say, no. To me, it's obvious that God exists. And my take on this is normally that I have the following take on this. So I tell you that Jesus invisible to everybody but me, is hiding in my closet and refuses to come out. Now you can choose to prove or disprove that. That usually ends the conversation.
Yeah.
So let me finally say that my book is, and I think you might have touched it, I forgot, individual essays. You don't have to read the whole thing right away at the same time. And I am starting to post a couple of YouTubes. I've started with one where I'm debating Jordan Peterson's daughter, also Ask Why Is It on YouTube. And I will come out with a couple of something around 30 rules for a good life on TikTok. Really short rules for a good life, part of which are here. I really enjoy talking to you. If I have talked too much, you may have to cut me out.
I hope you enjoyed the interview as much as I do. We do have a little bit of feedback and a correction or two. This came from Furky123 at mstdn.plus. That is on Mastodon. Our first ever Mastodon feedback. Furky wrote at HTOTW on today's episode of the podcast. Granted, this was a month ago. On today's episode of the podcast, you made a couple of mistakes. For the first mention of the Respect for Marriage Act, you called it DOMA, and Clarence Thomas's wife's name is Gini Thomas, not Anita Thomas. Oh my God, you have any idea how embarrassing this one is. Okay, not the confusing Respect for Marriage and Defense of Marriage acts. Those names are intentionally confusing political bullshit. Yeah, I'm not sorry for confusing that. They should have called it something a little bit more original, not just the exact same thing, but with one word different that means something similar. But the Gini Thomas and Anita Thomas mix-up, that was Anita Hill, who was not married at all ever at any time to Clarence Thomas, but was sexually harassed by Clarence Thomas for several years as she followed him through government agencies. My only excuse for this is that I grew up listening to lots and lots and lots of Rush Limbaugh while playing in my sandbox. And Rush Limbaugh apparently had quite the crush on Anita Hill because he could not stop talking about her through most of the 1990s. This was well after Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill were no longer having any kind of contact with each other, and long after Clarence Thomas had moved on to the, Supreme Court. But yeah, they are. Gini Thomas is Clarence Thomas's wife. She is a terrible, horrible person. She is a political hack who should not be, like, the fact that a political activist at the level that she is married to a Supreme Court justice is an atrocity that should not exist. Yes, I know it is problematic to say that a woman's career choices should be limited by her husband's job. But I would go with a non-gendered take on it of anybody married to somebody in a position as critical as a Supreme Court justice should not be a partisan agent, period. There are certain offices that should be beyond that, and unfortunately that also means that the spouses of people in those offices should be beyond that, and Gini Thomas is the terrible, horrible person who was actively involved in the January 6th insurrection. Anita Hill is a wonderful person who, totally unrelated, and I'm sorry, and embarrassed. If you want to send us feedback, you can use the contact form at htotw.com/contact. You can email us at contact@htotw.com. Leave a voicemail message at 208-996-8667 or the SpeakPipe button. You can also find us on Mastodon at htotw at mastodon.social, or you can follow the podcast itself and get notifications on the Fediverse of new podcast episodes by following at Dustin at htotw.com on Mastodon or any other Fediverse compliant service. I know that's a little bit confusing since the one with my name in it is the podcast directly. The one with the podcast name is me. I will fix that at some point. I don't know when. I did mention on the last episode that the Twitter accounts have been deleted. Those are still gone. I said that I would be deleting the Facebook page. That has not happened yet. The last time I tried to log in, I couldn't get in. So I will eventually delete that. You can support the show on a monthly basis with Patreon or just once with PayPal, credit, debit, Apple Pay, or Google Pay, and the links are all at htotw.com/donate. And you can find us on Discord as well, htotw.com/Discord. Until next time, this has been Humanist Take on the World. And remember, not all those who wander are lost.